So the human mind is a fickle thing. It can hallucinate. It can find patterns where there are none. And when left to its own devices, it can become a little mad. Tonight, we're gonna sit in the dark. But not the literal dark, but the kind you feel when your senses go quiet and your brain starts asking, now what? That's where the story begins. An empty room, a bored brain, and a pattern that runs through science, medicine, and survival lore. When the world falls silent, the mind starts to hum. It fills the void with people who aren't there, sounds that never happened, and timelines that stretch, maybe even snap. It does this not because we're broken, but because the human brain is built to predict, to guess, and to keep the show running even when the lights flicker. I'm your guide, not your guru, the mad scientist, to help tell the stories of the mind and of its madness. I'm going to walk you across the 5 edges where that brain itch shows up. I'm going to start with, first, a classic experiment that starved the senses and found hallucinations. Second, a tour of modern neuroscience that explains perception as nothing more than a stack of predictions. Third, the tools people use today to bend those predictions, from isolation tanks to magnetic stimulation. And fourth, the frozen hallway between dreaming and waking, where a presence can sit on your chest. And finally, the stories from climbers and castaways who swear a calm, unseen companion got them home. Because through all of it runs one honest idea. Perception is useful, but it's not perfect. It's a handshake between what hits your eyes and ears and what the brain expects to find. When the signal drops, expectation steps in. Sometimes that saves us, and sometimes it can scare us. Either way, it reveals how the system works. So come with me on this journey into the ARQIV, where we're all a little mad in here. Let's start our journey in a little story I like to call The Terror of the Void. In the early 1950s, a small group of volunteers at McGill University signed up for what sounded like easy money. All you had to do was sit in a quiet room, wear translucent goggles that turned the world milky white, pull soft gloves over your hands so touch felt distant, rest your head in a U-shaped pillow that muffled sound, and all you had to do is just stay put. The setup was actually called perceptual isolation. It was a polite phrase for stripping the senses down to a trickle. Within hours, many volunteers were restless. Within a day, their thoughts grew sticky. More than a few reported images that arrived uninvited. Patterns drifting across the blank field of vision. And the visions? Animals that weren't there. Scenes that faded in and out. The classic paper from the line of research has a careful title: Effects of Decreased Variation in the Sensory Environment. But the lived experience was anything but dry. When variations vanished, the mind supplied it. This wasn't a haunted house. It was a lab built on a blunt question. What happens to attention and thinking when the world stops changing? The results suggested that our minds do not idle well because we're prediction machines. When external input goes flat, the brain's internal model keeps talking and starts to dominate. What's striking is not that people hallucinated, but how quickly they did so when the outside world offered almost nothing to correct the brain's guesses. Fascinating. That theme has echoed through later histories and survival psychology, because the brain is an active storyteller, not a passive camera. If you zoom out from the lab and into history, you see the same dynamic in reports from solitary confinement and memoirs from explorers iced in the polar night. People, they describe music no one else can hear, or footsteps behind them. Figures at the edge of vision. The McGill studies didn't invent those stories. They gave a controlled glimpse of the mechanism. Starve the senses and the model, it will supply the content. Survival psychologists now treat that as one predictable problem of isolation and monotony. Not evidence of madness, though. Evidence of a system running with just little data. None of this says that the brain is fragile. No. It says the brain is active in a changing world. That activity is an advantage. In an unchanged world, the same activity spills over into invention. In the quiet, the world stops negotiating, but your brain, It does not. It writes the contract by itself and signs both names. If that sounds eerie, well, it's because it is. But it's also mechanical. So let's read the clauses. The prediction error. Correction. This is how perception is drafted before you even see a thing. Let's talk about the neurology, because your brain is a predictive engine. Modern neuroscience gives us a clean way to say the brain fills in the blanks. It's called predictive processing. On this view, perception is the brain's best guess, giving two things: what's coming in through the senses, right? And what models of the world we already carry around with us. Because technically, the brain tries to minimize prediction error, what theorists call free energy. In plain terms, it wants expectations to match the noisy data arriving from the eyes, ears, and skin and the body's interior. The brain updates those expectations when the mismatch gets big enough. That's not quite spiritual. It's more statistics. Here's a picture to hold on to. Think of the brain as running a weather model of reality. When those reports are rich and consistent, the model learns and corrects. When the stations go offline, the model keeps forecasting based on its own dynamics. It often does pretty well. I mean, your hand still finds the coffee cup in the dark, but it can drift. Small errors, they creep in. Confidence gets misplaced. And that's when you feel a presence that isn't there, or see patterns blooming on walls. Now, you can notice that forecasting in everyday life. You reach for the light switch before you even see it. You swear you heard your name in a cafe full of noise. In both cases, the brain is learning on priors, those learned expectations that speed up perception. Usually that's efficient. Sometimes it's misleading. One of the clearest examples of the system inventing content when input collapses is Charles Bonnet syndrome, or people who lose parts of their sight, often older adults with macular disease. They start seeing vivid images superimposed on real scenes. They're looking at faces, animals, paisley patterns, miniature cityscapes that play out silently. The images can be beautiful or even bizarre, but they don't talk, they don't command, and people usually know they're not real. The visual cortex, it stays active, and when input is weak, the brain's model basically supplies the content. That's why the UK, that's the United Kingdom, health guidance is careful to reassure patients these images are a vision loss effect, not dementia or mental illness. Recent reviews echo the same point and offer practical coping advice. Add light, move your gaze, talk about it so the fear drops. When you understand that the model is filling in, the fill-in loses its power. Predictive processing doesn't claim nothing is real. It says experience is always a negotiated truce between the world and the model. Most days the truce holds, but when the signal drops or the model gets loud, perception tilts toward invention. And that's not a character flaw. That's a system designed to keep you moving under uncertainty. If the void can bend perception, maybe tools can too. Let's see if we can use technology to nudge our brain model. If quiet makes the brain invent, we can test that on purpose. First, let's talk about flotation therapy, also called REST. It's restricted environmental simulation therapy. Then we'll look into a clinical tool that uses magnet pulses to nudge brain circuits. But right now, let's talk about flotation therapy, or REST. It's supposed to be relaxing. You step into a light, tight pod or even a small private room. The water is loaded with Epsom salt. Sounds lovely. So the moment you lie back, you float without effort. The temperature sits around skin neutral, about 95 degrees Fahrenheit. So after a minute, you can't tell where water ends and air begins. Then you put on the earplugs, lights off, eyes open or closed. The scene is the same because it's near total darkness inside this pod. From the inside, the first thing you notice is your own body. Your breath gets loud. Your heartbeat becomes a steady click. 10 minutes in, the edges of your body soften. Some people feel taller, others wider, as if the outline has drifted. Time loses its grip. 5-minute stretches, an hour collapses, worries step back, and sometimes boredom shows up. Then a daydream. This daydream state, it takes over. That's the predictive brain running with less input. With fewer corrections arriving from the series, your internal model carries more of the show. Researchers have tested this, not just collected spa stories. In a head-to-head comparison, 1 hour of floating beat a matched hour of quiet rest on measure of altered experience, stronger time distortions, looser body boundaries, and sharper drops in anxiety right after the session. When you zoom out across studies, the pattern is cautious but consistent. Flotation looks safe for most people and often helps with stress, pain, and mood. It's not magic. If you have uncontrolled epilepsy, for instance, fresh skin wounds, or severe claustrophobia, make sure you get medical attention first, because I just play a mad scientist on this show. But as a tool to thin the signal and watch the model stretch, a float is a clean experiment that you can actually feel. Now, a very different experience. Let's talk about magnets in a clinic. Now, this is transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS. So you sit in a chair, a technician positions a coil against your scalp, boop, guided by head measurements or brain imaging. You have ear protection because, the coils click. And when the session starts, you feel firm tapping on the scalp and brief twitches in nearby muscles. Now, a visit lasts 20 to 40 minutes, and treatment in medical programs happens about 5 days a week for several weeks. Typical side effects are mild headaches or scalp tenderness that fade the same day. The rare serious risk, obviously, is seizures, which is why screening, dosing, and a trained staff really matter in these situations. But why would I bring TMS into a Halloween hour about perception? Because when you aim at the right network with enough field strength, you can change symptoms tied to what the brain hears and feels. In careful trials, images guided by TMS reduced distressing auditory hallucinations compared with sham treatments, and the benefit lasted at follow-up. And just as a quick sidebar, so terms don't get blurred in the situation, you may have also heard of something called the God helmet. That device used very weak, patterned magnetic fields and made headlines. For claims about sensing a presence in a tight double-blind study, those effects tracked suggestibility more than the fields itself. TMS is not that at all. TMS uses much stronger, clinically regulated pulses and has evidence for specific symptoms when it's targeted well. Different tool, different bar of proof. But here are two tools, two levers. Rest thins the signal, TMS nudges the network. Both let us watch a predictive brain change its story when we change the conditions. Now, the most terrifying thing the mind actually does. You wake, you can't move, and then your mind brings something into the room. So if you've ever had sleep paralysis, you don't forget it. You wake up, or you think you do. You can see the room, but your body won't move. Your chest, it feels heavy. You have a sense that someone is there. You try to call for help and nothing happens. The episode lasts a minute or two, then releases you with a jolt. Okay, so in REM, the brain keeps your muscles offline. It's really a safety feature so dream actions don't become real movements. Sometimes that muscle paralysis leaks into wakefulness while your awareness comes back online. You get the conscious witness with the body still in REM mode. A panic spike follows, and the predictive brain tries to make sense of the mismatch. And this is when threat-shaped hallucinations walk in. Even scarier, cultures put different faces on the intruder. In Newfoundland, it's the old hag. In parts of Southeast Asia, a pressing spirit. And in Japan, Kanashibari. The physiology looks the same. REM atonia colliding with waking awareness paired with a brain primed to detect agents, beings with intent, when we actually feel vulnerable. Education helps in these respects because knowing the mechanics can shrink the terror. Keeping a regular sleep schedule helps a lot. Some people have light in the room to bias expectations. A subset learn to convert the transition into lucid dreaming. But the point is not to mock the demon. The point is to understand the machine. The brain seeks a story that fits the feeling. Change the state, and the story changes with it. A few practical notes on this matter here. First, your breathing is actually okay during this process. The chest feels heavy because the diaphragm is doing the work without help from accessory muscles, not because air is cut off or there is an actual hag on your chest. Second, the episode ends on its own. Fighting to move can actually spike panic and intensify the imagery. And third, tiny controllable actions help. Things like wiggling your toes or focusing on slow breaths, or fixing on a thought that anchors you until the state flips. Clinicians look at stress trauma history, and sleep debt is a risk multiplier. The advice is boring and effective: regular hours, more sleep, lower stress where possible. And finally, the endurance, the third man factor. I call them the helpers. Science probably calls them that too, but Here we go. In survival stories, there's a reoccurring theme. A climber near the summit, a sailor on a life raft, a polar team out of food. They all report a calm voice or a silent companion that walks beside them, keeps them focused, and tells them what to do next. And it's not a horror figure, it's a guide. Writer John Geiger popularized the label, the third man factor, after a line from T.S. Eliot about a mysterious extra person on a long walk. Psychologists who studied extreme environments describe plausible ingredients: cold isolation, monotony, exhaustion, fear, hunger, and dehydration, and the cognitive load of making life-preserving decisions hour after hour. Mix those with predictive brain that socializes everything, including our own inner monologue, and the appearance of a helper makes mechanistic sense. It's the mind giving itself company and structure. And here's how to treat that presence as a tool rather than a myth if it ever happens to you and you're trying to survive. Structure your own cognition under stress. Talk out loud. Set tiny goals. Break time into more segments. If you notice your mind inventing a supportive companion, treat it as a coping strategy. Because the question is never, is this real? The question is this helping me to do the next safe thing? Now, if you frame it that way, the third man stops being a ghost story and becomes one more level for self-regulation, especially when the world is hostile and the stakes are high. Now, we don't romanticize this. There are limits, especially when it comes to dehydration, hypothermia, altitude sickness, and head injury, or, these things might impair judgment. The voice that says jump is not a helper. The useful version is the one that keeps you anchored to routine and risk. Survival psychology is clear on this point. Cognition under extreme load benefits from structure and perceived social support. If a constructed companion can provide that structure in the absence of real company, the advantage is obvious, right? So what to do with this knowledge that's been dropped onto you by this mad scientist? Because across these stories, lab isolation, vision loss, flotation tanks, magnets, sleep paralysis, polar marches, the pattern is all the same. Perception is a handshake between incoming data and internal models. When the data goes sparse or the model gets loud, we should expect the handshake to wobble. And that wobble, it can feel like eyes in the corner of the room, hands on the chest, or a friend at your side during your worst moments. It can also be gentler, time stretching into a dark float, the border of your body melting into warm water. But this raises a really hard question. If the brain is always guessing, can we really trust anything? Now, the practical answer is yes. With routines, you trust the parts that prove themselves useful and repeatable. You cross-check with others. You learn where your system is likely to lean too hard on with prior beliefs, and you design around that. Pilots use checklists. Divers use buddy rules. People with Charles Bonnet syndrome adjust lighting and talk openly with clinicians so the images lose their sting. If you're prone to sleep paralysis, you can change the conditions that trigger it and practice the moves that carry you through it. These are not admissions of weakness. They are an acknowledgement that we live by design in a world of uncertainty. When we manage our models, we have better outcomes. For technology, the message is simple. Strong, well-targeted magnetic stimulation has growing clinical evidence to change symptoms linked to specific networks. But weak, suggestive devices have not met the same bar. In altered state spaces like flotation, the research signal is encouraging but really early at this point. The safety looks good and the benefits seem really good, likely in stress and mood and behavioral issues. For some people, the experiences can be profound, but the bigger claims, things like memory hacks and creativity revolutions, those need the same rigor of study. Because if a study isn't randomized and blinded with clear outcomes, treat it as an interesting story, not a settled result. Most of all, this line of research asks for humility. The mind is not a camera, it's an artist under constraints, tasked with generating a coherent world from incomplete input. In rich environments, that artist is reined in by evidence. In sparse ones, it gets more freedom. Sometimes it paints a demon, sometimes a guide who walks you off a glacier. Neither outcome means you've lost your grip on reality. Both mean your system is working hard in managing itself, negotiating, predicting, and keeping you moving. So the mind at the beginning of this is a fickle thing. You create your own world around you, inside you, internally. It does things to survive. And that makes it both fascinating and terrifying. Thank you for joining me on this Halloween episode of the ARQIV. If you haven't already done so, please subscribe, like, give me a thumbs up and a comment. Until then, keep being weird.